Officers ask me all the time, what questions can I ask during a lawful Terry stop? For example, I stop someone for speeding. What questions can I ask them? Am I limited to asking them questions about speeding? Or can I ask unrelated questions like, where are you coming from? Or may I search your vehicle? I'm going to be talking about New Mexico law in this episode of the podcast and explaining for my New Mexico officers what our Supreme Court says about extending the scope of a traffic stop and what questions you are limited to. I'm going to break it down for you right now. What's up, everybody? I'm attorney Eric Scramlin, and this is the Tactical In-Service Podcast, a podcast for law enforcement, where I break down training topics and case law to help you, the law enforcement community, stay up on the law. Today, I'm going to be talking about New Mexico-specific case law in regards to what an officer can do during a lawful Terry stop. Specifically, what can an officer do when the officer stops a vehicle, what they're limited to. As I mentioned in the intro of this video, the United States Supreme Court has made it very clear that an officer under Arizona versus Johnson, I'll leave a link in the description below, make sure you read that case, but the United States Supreme Court has made clear under the Fourth Amendment that an officer can ask any questions essentially they want, even ones unrelated to the reason for the stop, as long as it doesn't measurably extend the traffic stop. So under the United States Supreme Court analysis, an officer can stop a vehicle for speeding and ask questions about where are you coming from? Do you have any rocket launchers or guns or grenades or drugs in the vehicle? As long as it doesn't extend it past what it would reasonably take to do a typical speeding investigation. Under New Mexico law, it's quite a bit different. For you New Mexico officers out there, you should know and realize by now that New Mexico uses what we call the interstitial approach, meaning that our New Mexico Supreme Court has interpreted our state constitution, Article 2, Section 10, which is our version of the Fourth Amendment. They've interpreted that as giving far greater rights than the Fourth Amendment does, which means the analysis is different in New Mexico. You cannot just rely on Fourth Amendment case law like Arizona versus Johnson because we take a different approach under state law. This is important, New Mexico officers. With the recent passage of HB 4, the New Mexico Civil Rights Act, it creates a civil cause of action for violation of the state constitution. So that means even though you may be following Fourth Amendment case law analysis from the U.S. Supreme Court, you could still be found to have violated someone's civil rights under the state constitution. So you've got to know and understand the analysis under New Mexico law. And that's what I'm going to do in this episode. I want to take a few minutes and talk about a case called State versus Teuton that was released by the New Mexico Court of Appeals in 2020. So it's still fairly a new case. I get these questions a lot about officers. I had an officer reach out to me last week. I decided, hey, this would be a good topic to talk about and discuss on the podcast because I get asked this question a lot. And I'll also say, as a prosecutor, this was my number one area for suppression issues. Officer makes a traffic stop for a taillight being out or speeding, and then they get consent to search for drugs. And the question is, how did they build that bridge? How did they expand the scope of their stop? And a lot of times, if we can't show reasonable suspicion, it leads to a suppression issue. So this is the number one area that I see it under New Mexico law. So I want to make sure you guys understand that and talk briefly about this case, State versus Teuton. Before I jump in, though, if I can ask you all to take a minute, hit the subscribe button if you're watching this on YouTube. If you're listening to the podcast, make sure you add me to your favorites. I'm just getting started on this channel. I'm trying to get out these episodes to discuss case law whenever a case is new, or just go over old training topics, not just for the New Mexico law enforcement community, but for all law enforcement out there, but specifically for you New Mexico officers. Since I'm here in New Mexico, I like to cover topics because the law is so different here. So if you want to help me out, hit that subscribe button and follow the podcast. All right. So before I jump into Teuton, let's do a quick review. Let's take a look at what we know about a Terry stop. So, of course, a Terry stop comes from the famous Supreme Court case, Terry v. Ohio, in which the United States Supreme Court carved out an exception to the warrant requirement, in which the Supreme Court said that it is reasonable for an officer to detain someone based on reasonable suspicion that criminal activity is afoot. I refer to this in my courses as RSCAAF, reasonable suspicion, criminal activity afoot. What does that mean? A little bit beyond the scope of this episode. I do have a couple episodes where I discuss reasonable suspicion. If you haven't listened to those, I'll have it scroll up here on the screen somewhere. Take a listen to that where I try to break down more about what reasonable suspicion is. But generally speaking, the Terry case gives the authority to officers to temporarily detain someone, to investigate, to confirm or dispel that reasonable suspicion. So in the context of a traffic stop, as an officer, if you find someone speeding, maybe there's a traffic violation of some sorts, you turn the lights on, they're seized under the Fourth Amendment in Article 2, Section 10. So we need to have a warrant or an exception to the warrant requirement. Well, in this situation, we have a Terry stop. You're going to investigate the speeding, the taillight violation, the plate that didn't come back on file, whatever the case is, that reasonable suspicion that you developed, you're there to investigate that. So for our example, let's say that we have some traffic violations, maybe a speeding, maybe a taillight out, maybe a fail to stop at a stop sign. When you make that traffic stop, what questions can you ask? Well, as I mentioned, the United States Supreme Court has told us in Arizona versus Johnson that an officer can ask questions, not just about speeding, because that's what you're there to investigate, or running the stop sign or whatever, but you can ask questions that are totally unrelated. You can ask questions about where are you coming from? Do you have any guns? Do you have any rocket launchers, grenades, dead bodies, drugs in the vehicle? Do I have consent to search your vehicle? You can ask all those things as long as it doesn't extend the length of that detention past what it would normally take a reasonable officer to do, like 10 to 15 minutes probably on like a speeding or a stop sign case. However, New Mexico officers, this is where you need to pay attention. Under New Mexico law, our New Mexico Supreme Court has made it clear under the interstitial approach that we do not follow the reasoning in Arizona versus Johnson. Instead, here, applying greater rights under our Constitution, the courts have limited you to only asking questions that are reasonably related to the reason for the stop. And in this case that I'm going to discuss, State versus Teuton, which I'm going to leave a link in the description below. I encourage you to read the case. It's a really good case that kind of goes through the history, so make sure you take the time to read the case. But I'm going to tell you what it means. So in this case, the court shows us just how strict they are with this requirement. And as I mentioned, the court is limiting you to asking questions that are reasonably related to the reason for the stop. Unlike Arizona versus Johnson, you are not allowed to ask questions that are not related to the stop. So if you stop someone for speeding, what questions can you ask them? You're limited to questions about speeding. And in this case, State versus Teuton, they show you just how strict they are. So let's talk about the case. In Teuton, officers made a traffic stop for typical traffic violations. I believe it was a stop sign violation and I think a tail light, if I remember correctly. The officers get the traffic stop. The officers say the driver's acting a little nervous, so he asks him to get out of the car. Totally fine. Case law supports that. No problem there. But then the officer, as the officer starts writing the ticket and the citation, just asks the question, "Where are you coming from?" And the suspect responded, "I'm coming from a friend's house." And the officer said, "Oh yeah, which friend?" "Josh." It wouldn't happen to be Josh, I forget his last name, but the officer says the person's last name. And the suspect says, "Yeah, matter of fact, that is whose house I'm coming from." Well, the officer knows Josh as being someone that's involved in narcotics. The officer has personally dealt with this person. So based on that, the officer says, based on that, the officer decides to do a Terry pat, which again is outside the scope of this, but under the circumstances, it would have been reasonable if the officer was still within the scope of the stop. So the officer does the Terry pat and gets consent to search the wallet, finds drugs in the wallet. Okay, so the defendant raises the suppression issue in court that the officer violated or unreasonably extended the scope of the traffic stop. So the defense is arguing that he was stopped for a traffic violation, taillight, and running a stop sign. And when the officer said, "Where are you coming from? Which friend?" that was beyond the scope of the reason for the stop, meaning that the officer under New Mexico law was limited to asking questions about the reason for the traffic stop, which is literally questions about the taillight being out or running the stop sign. Our New Mexico Court of Appeals ruled that the officer did indeed exceed the scope of the traffic stop by asking the questions about where are you coming from, which means the Terry Pat, everything that was found after that under the exclusionary rule or tainted by a fruit of the poisonous tree was inadmissible. So, okay, what is the court telling us here? Let's take a step back. The court is saying under these circumstances, the officer made a stop for a taillight and running a stop sign. Under New Mexico law, the court is saying that an officer is limited to only asking questions about the reason for the stop. So questions about the taillight and about running the stop sign. When the officer said, "Where are you coming from?" it was beyond the scope of the reason for that traffic stop. The officer did not have reasonable suspicion based on any crime to ask questions about where this person was coming from. Therefore, the court found that it violated the scope of the traffic stop. So how do you get there? How do you get from a traffic stop for speeding, or in this case, a taillight or stop sign? How do you get to getting consent to search a vehicle and finding drugs? You get there by developing additional reasonable suspicion, and you have to articulate it. So if you make a traffic stop with someone based on a taillight or running a stop sign, in that time that it takes to investigate that, you got to stay within the scope. You're not allowed to ask questions outside of that scope. But if you develop additional reasonable suspicion that there's drugs in the vehicle, like back in the old days, the odor of marijuana, that's not going to work anymore because it's essentially been legalized in New Mexico. But maybe you can see in plain view in the vehicle a syringe or those small corner cut baggies, a scale, a white powdery substance on the driver's lap, something that you can articulate to get you to reasonable suspicion that there's another crime going on. And if you can do that within the scope of that original stop, you can expand the scope of your stop to go into an additional investigation. You can't just jump there. You can't stop someone for speeding and just start investigating about drugs or some other offense. You have to stay limited to the scope of your stop. And then if you can develop additional reasonable suspicion, you have to articulate those facts. If you do that, it'll be lawful. If you don't, then you'll go beyond the scope of the stop. So the important lessons that I want you to take from this Teuton case is, number one, you have to understand as a New Mexico officer that United States Supreme Court case law, you have to know it, but it doesn't always necessarily apply here as far as what you can do. So in Arizona versus Johnson, under Fourth Amendment analysis, the court says you can ask questions unrelated to the reason for the stop as long as you don't unreasonably extend the length of the stop. The New Mexico Court of Appeals says not so fast. Under our Constitution, you are limited to only asking questions about the reason for the stop. However, if you can develop additional reasonable suspicion and articulate those facts, that's the key. You got to articulate the facts that get you into another crime, then you can go there. And that's totally fine, but you have to articulate those facts. So make sure you know this. Make sure you understand it. This is just a small part of how New Mexico law varies from Fourth Amendment analysis. If you want to know more about all of the things that apply under New Mexico law, you can check out my website at tacticalattorney.com. I have a full New Mexico search and seizure course. Right now, I can come and bring that to your department. We do webinars. I'm working on doing the virtual academy where we'll put all the stuff online. Whatever it is, I have the course. It's available. Go to the website, contact me. I'd be happy to bring this to your department. So I hope this helps give you a little bit better understanding about the scope of the traffic stop, because I get this question all the time. Make sure you take time to read the case. Leave the link in the description below. In the description below. Stay on top of the law. It's very important now more than ever that you stay on top of the law and understand what you're doing out there. So I hope this helps, everybody. Stay safe. Remember, every battle is won before it's fought. I will see you on the next episode.